On the same day, he hosted Russia's annual Victory Day parade in Moscow. Such as it was, Vladimir Putin met with Alan Gagloyev, the president of South Ossetia, to sign a historic treaty, the third major treaty between the two entities since 2008. So, what is this treaty for? The reporting in the South Ossetia media, such as it is, has been very vague about the details, other than saying it's a good thing for the country. Well, I've read the actual treaty, and there's something in it that the South Ossetian media is not talking about, something they don't want the people of South Ossetia to notice. Tucked away among the vague platitudes that make up most of this document is a provision, a very unusual provision, which will allow the Kremlin to take direct control over the South Ossetian government in May 2027. You may think I'm just speculating, but just 2 days after the treaty took effect, the Kremlin takeover of South Ossetia began. We even know who Putin wants to install as the next president of South Ossetia. So, in reality, this isn't South Ossetia signing a treaty with Russia. This is President Gagloyev signing over complete control of his country to Vladimir Putin. Stay tuned, I'll explain. Hi everyone, I'm Fredo Rockwell, and in a video that I made last year about South Ossetia, I described it as a zombie republic. It has very few people, a tiny economy, doesn't even grow enough food to feed itself, and the government there is totally dependent on aid from Russia to pay for just about anything. But up till now, South Ossetia has had its own elections, which, despite what you might think, appear to be reasonably competitive, or at least there have been peaceful transfers of power between political parties. The standard explanation for why the Kremlin has allowed this to happen is that, ultimately, it doesn't matter who the president of South Ossetia is. Whoever wins will continue to take their orders from Moscow. Letting open but meaningless elections take place doesn't do any harm, and it's possibly a good way to keep the local population happy. But if my reading of the recent treaty and the events that followed it is correct, that's all about to change. We'll get to exactly why and how it's going to change in just a moment, but first, let's have a quick review of all things South Ossetia. South Ossetia is located in the Caucasus Mountains, next to Russia, within the internationally recognized borders of Georgia. At roughly the same time Georgia declared independence from the Soviet Union in the early 90s, South Ossetia declared independence from Georgia. But that de facto independence became much more serious when Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, after which Russia established a military base in the breakaway republic and recognized South Ossetia as a sovereign country. This recognition was established in a treaty, the first Russian-South Ossetian treaty, which also committed the two parties to being allies and legalized dual citizenship. And by the way, all three treaties that we're going to discuss today can be accessed through links in the pinned comment below, so check them out if you want to read them yourself. The fallout from the 2008 invasion and the treaty that followed it was that trade and travel between South Ossetia and the rest of Georgia has been getting gradually harder and harder, while trade and travel from South Ossetia to Russia has been getting easier and easier. Although when I say trade, I'm using that term fairly loosely because since 2008, South Ossetia's population and economy have been shrinking dramatically. Officially, South Ossetia has about 58,000 citizens, but some estimates put that number as low as 26,000 or even lower, and the vast majority of those 58,000 or 26,000 people are very poor. As I explained in my previous video on South Ossetia, government employee salaries are often below the official poverty line, which is only $264 per month. And I found one report of a postal worker in rural South Ossetia who is paid only $75 per month. So to help South Ossetia's economy, the two parties signed a second treaty in 2015. This not only reaffirms the right to dual citizenship, but also promises to grant Russian citizenship to anyone from South Ossetia who wants it. This allows South Ossetians to live and work in Russia, which is a very attractive offer for many because not only can they earn more money and enjoy a much higher standard of living, but the part of Russia that borders South Ossetia is called North Ossetia, which is populated mostly by people from the same Ossetian ethnic group. So this treaty has created serious economic benefits for the people of South Ossetia, but at the same time, it paved the way for much of the economically active population to leave the country. And that's what they've done. And so South Ossetia's economy is caught in this sort of death spiral. As people leave for North Ossetia and other parts of Russia, the economy shrinks, which makes it more attractive for more people to leave, and so on. As the economy shrinks, what passes for a state in South Ossetia becomes more and more dependent on aid from Russia. According to its own figures, in 2023, 80% of the state budget was supplied by a direct grant from Moscow. Except the money in those direct grants that Moscow sends to South Ossetia to pay for things has a tendency to disappear. Between 2008 and 2010, just after the invasion, Russia provided South Ossetia with $840 million to rebuild itself. But Russia soon realized that so much of the money was being siphoned off, it was having virtually no impact on the problems it was meant to solve. And this sort of behavior appears to have continued. In April of this year, for example, South Ossetian MP Vladimir Alexeyev accused President Gagloyev of embezzling $20 million of Russian loan money and called on him to resign. It's my understanding that in the Russian political system, it's normal, even expected, for officials to pocket a bit of cash here or there. But this sort of graft on a Trump-like scale must have really annoyed the officials in Kremlin that were footing the bill. And so, perhaps fed up with the absolute circus that passes for a political system in South Ossetia, Russia arranged for a third treaty to be signed. Almost all of it is just general and vague promises to deepen cooperation and integration, but one article, Article 2, contains something that caught my attention. Citizens of one contracting party may hold state and municipal positions, positions of state and municipal service in state and municipal bodies of the other contracting party, which is a very wordy way of saying that Russian citizens can now hold elected office and civil service positions in South Ossetia, and vice versa. And then it says, actually, I'm not going to read this one because the language is really convoluted, but basically it says that any time you've spent living in either country counts towards any residency requirements that you have if you want to run for office in either country. What this means is, thanks to this treaty, Russians can now run for any office in South Ossetia anytime they'd like to. And of course, South Ossetians can also now run for office in Russia. That's not going to happen, but yeah, technically, Alan Gagloyev can now run against Putin in Russia's 2030 presidential elections. Go Alan! So, let's recap. After decades of corruption and economic mismanagement, Russia may finally have given up with the South Ossetian ruling elite, who are responsible for that corruption and economic mismanagement. And now, Russia and South Ossetia have signed a treaty that would allow a Russian citizen to become president of South Ossetia. If this was to happen through a normal presidential election, the next opportunity is May 2027. Now, if I ran the Kremlin, and this was my plan, I wouldn't do anything really obvious really quickly that people would be sure to notice. People, dumb YouTubers like me might notice it and make a video about it. I wouldn't do that. But obviously I don't run the Kremlin, and that's exactly what they've done, which I find hard to believe. So, following the signing of the treaty on May 9th, Vladimir Putin signed the law to enact it on May 25th. And then, the next day, this article appeared. This is from a relatively minor publication called Novaya Vedomosti and is written by an unknown journalist, but it makes this startling claim. The Russian presidential administration is considering Marat Kambolov, first vice president of the Kurchatov Institute Research Center, as the most likely candidate for the post of president of South Ossetia. Marat Kambolov, as the article goes to great lengths to explain, has close ties to the Kremlin, and before he took up his current job, he was Russia's Deputy Minister of Education and Science. And perhaps most importantly, Kambolov is Ossetian, so he knows the culture, and maybe even the language of South Ossetia, but also he is North Ossetian. The article also explains in precise detail that while Kambolov has close ties to his home region, he hardly knows anyone in Tsin Valley, and hardly anyone there knows him. In other words, he's a man trusted by the Kremlin with a good understanding of the local culture, but has no ties to any of the factions in South Ossetia's government. If you're going to insert your own man into a difficult political situation like this, Kambolov sounds perfect. A bit too perfect, to be honest. And since I'd never heard of this publication, Novaya Vedmosti, I decided to ask my new friend, the exiled Russian journalist Dmitry Treschyanin, for his reaction. Those of you who are regular readers of my newsletter will know that Dmitry subscribed to my channel a few months ago, and we got in touch. And for those of you who aren't regular readers of my newsletter, I mean, seriously, what are you doing? The link is in the description of the video. Subscribe already. Dmitry thought the whole article was pretty suspicious, especially as the named author seems to be a very irregular contributor, and Dmitry also said it was quite common in Russia for the Kremlin to pass articles to the media that they wanted published, but figuring out what the exact motive behind these articles is, if you're not a government insider, is almost impossible. So basically, even though the information in this article sounds plausible, even maybe credible, figuring out whether it's true or not is impossible. Only time will tell. And that time was one day, because the next day, the things that the article predicted started happening. South Ossetia's official state news service announced the appointment of a new state advisor to President Gagloyev, Marat Kambolov. Here he is in this official photo, along with an article explaining to the South Ossetian people who Kambolov is, because they don't know. Virtually no one in South Ossetia will have heard of this guy before. Looking at this picture, I almost feel sorry for President Gagloyev. He's been pressured into hiring this guy he doesn't know as one of his top assistants, knowing full well that Kambolov is there to shadow him for a year, learn the job, and then push him out of office. And I think he almost certainly will do this, because none of this story makes any sense if that's not the plan. But here's an important question. Is there anything more to this story other than the Kremlin just wanting more control over what happens in South Ossetia and how its money is spent there? Maybe. Before his appointment as state advisor to Gagloyev, I mentioned that Kambolov was a senior figure in the Kurchatov Institute, the main research center in Russia that advises the government on nuclear energy and other mega-science projects that are vital to national security. So Kambolov had a really important job in a really important institution. And I find it unlikely that Moscow would ask someone as important as Kambolov to quit his high-flying Moscow career to take up what is, essentially, a role as a provincial administrator, unless they had something bigger in mind. If all they wanted was direct control, I'm sure they could have found a less senior lackey who would be just as willing to take their orders. The Novaya Vedmosti article plays up the role the Kurchatov Institute has in planning major infrastructure projects. I wasn't able to confirm it really does this, but it sounds plausible. Could the Kremlin be thinking they want to build some sort of mega project in South Ossetia? A project that would require a lot of money and someone trustworthy and competent to oversee and manage its construction? I'm just speculating here, but basically, I find it hard to believe that Kambolov is being lined up to be president of South Ossetia just so he can be a glorified babysitter. One thing I don't think will happen is Russia formally annexing South Ossetia. Its status as a breakaway republic inside Georgia's internationally recognized borders suits the Kremlin just fine. And let's remember, last year's victory parade in Russia was attended by 30 foreign leaders, but this year there were only 7, and that's only if you count Gagloyev and President Gumba of Abkhazia. Putin can't afford to do anything that would reduce the number of leaders who would show up for him next year. And with things going so badly in the war against Ukraine, it's possible that, without the leaders of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, Putin will be watching next year's parade by himself. One last thing before I go. As is my habit, I did text Mr. Kambolov and ask him if he wanted to be on my video. I found his account on Telegram. He hasn't looked at the message. Doesn't look like he's been on Telegram for a week or so. So anyway, that's a shame. But if you've gotten this far, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Subscribe to the newsletter. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video.